Hello and welcome everyone. You're listening to the Theology Mill from Wipf and Stock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I work here at Wipf and Stock, and I'm also the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with some of the leading authors in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. If you like what you hear on our podcast, come stop by our website at wipfandstock.com. That's WIPF and stock, STOCK.com. So in this interview for our Barth Booth, I had the honor and privilege of talking with Dr. Stanley Hauerwas, who needs no introduction certainly, but who is the Gilbert T. Rowe Professor Emeritus of Divinity and Law at Duke Divinity School. Also in 2001, Time magazine named him America's Best Theologian. And he's the author of many, many books, including his most recent book on Karl Barth, which is called Fully Alive, The Apocalyptic Humanism of Karl Barth. In our interview here, Stanley speaks with me about the relationship between Barth and postliberalism. He also talks about Barth's engagements with thinkers as diverse as Anselm and the German dialectical theologians. We also talk about the nature of theological language in Barth's corpus, and then what it means to read Barth in the American context today. In the show notes, you can find a link for our Barth Booth where you can browse a pretty substantial selection of Wipf and Stock's books by and about Karl Barth, as well as a 50% discount on all the books that are featured in that booth. And that discount runs through April 14th, 2023. So without further ado, friends, let's head over to the interview. So I'm very honored to be here with Stanley Hauerwas, who is the Gilbert T. Rowe Professor Emeritus of Divinity and Law at Duke Divinity School. He was also named by Time magazine America's Best Theologian in 2001. And he's the author of too many books to name here, but most recently of a book with University of Virginia Press called Fully Alive, The Apocalyptic Humanism of Karl Barth. And so we are sharing a drink. I have just a black coffee that I French pressed this morning. I think it's Colombian origin, the beans are, and it's from a roaster here called Water Ave, which I really like. What are you drinking, Stanley?
Water.
You've got water. Nice. Just classic. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and dive into Karl Barth. So I'm curious how and when you discovered Barth, and then also if you could share a bit about if your reading of him has changed or developed in significant ways throughout your career.
I read Barth originally in my first year in Divinity School at Yale Divinity. I had gone to the Divinity School thinking that if I were to be a Christian, I would be a Tillician or Bultmannian, because I thought decisive event that suggested Christianity might not be true was the Holocaust. And I thought it was the liberals that must have been against Hitler and his minions. But I was shocked to discover it was Barth and Bonhoeffer. And I was immersed in Barth in systematic theology, where I had Julian Hart as the main professor in the course. And I had a wonderful preceptor who guided me through the reading of I think we were reading 2:2 as one of the texts in the course, and you can just feel overwhelmed when you first get into Barth. And I liked the way he overwhelmed you, and I just continued to read beyond what was required for the course in a way that Barth more or less took over my reading.
Yeah, sure. And then as you've continued to kind of read him over the years, has your understanding of him changed? Have you have you grown, or has your reading of him just changed at all throughout your career?
Barth is always new, so you are constantly surprised by his ability to help you see what you hadn't seen before. His reading of Scripture is quite extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
But how he integrates that reading with contemporary sources is really, I think, absolutely ingenious. So I don't know, I can't document in what way I may have changed my reading of him or my views about him, but I've always found him a resource that makes me think again what I thought had settled. The Christological center of Barth is so overwhelming in terms of how he uses his Christology to illumine every doctrine is something that is always worth following.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing from others as well, is that Christology is really his fundamental source throughout all of his church dogmatics and his whole corpus, which is wonderful. Which that may in some ways answer our next question. But what would you say impresses you the most about Barth as a theologian?
His unapologetic forcefulness of saying what needs to be said without apology. And he has such a wonderful sense of humor about how he works in a way that is attractive, pull you in to his extraordinarily substantive world. That the humor and the God-centeredness of Barth, I think, are closely interrelated.
Yeah. What would you say? I mean, he's got such a vast amount of writings, and even just his church dogmatics, right, is 14 volumes long. But if you had to kind of trace a thread through all of his writings, what would you describe as kind of the heart of his work?
Jesus is Lord. Crackers and Grapefruit Juice podcast likes to quote me, and Jesus Christ is Lord, everything else is bullshit.
Yeah.
Well, that's a Barthian notion. He's determined to show you the workings of theological language in a way that makes you surprised at the way it works to help you know what it means to say God is God and we are not.
Mm-hmm.
Barth, in the chapters on Barth in my Gifford lectures, where I argued that Barth is the great natural theologian of modernity. And I start the second chapter on Barth with, I can only repeat myself. Barth could only repeat himself because he could not provide a basis for underwriting the fundamental convictions of a Christian. Because if he provided such a basis, then you would provide a reductionistic Christology, which his whole work is meant to avoid. There's always something more to say. So he could only repeat himself.
Mm-hmm.
14 volumes is a lot of repeating,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's always fresh.
Now, and from my understanding, that was sort of the reason why he sort of turned away from kind of the dialectical theologians, the group of other German scholars who he was kind of closely affiliated with early in his career. So, could you say a little bit about kind of what led him to turn away from those dialectical theologians?
Well, the story is always repeated that it was the signing of support for the war of the Kaiser in World War I by Protestant liberals that made Barth turn against what he thought he was learning in liberal theology. And there's no doubt, there's some truth to that, but I suspect Barth would have made those moves determined, even if there hadn't been that kind of nationalism displayed by Protestant liberals.
Mm-hmm.
But Barth doesn't explain Christian convictions. He uses them in a way to illumine the way things are. It's an extraordinary adventure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, if you had to sort of turn towards Barth and kind of poke and prod some holes in his thinking, or just even if you could share a bit about if there were sort of problems in Barth that came up in his theology, and then are there any knots in his thinking sort of that he was trying to unravel or kind of just clarify as he continued writing throughout his life?
Well, I've said in other places that Barth's ecclesiology is thin, and the word overwhelms the church for Barth.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's true and untrue. That Barth always says somewhere something you thought he didn't understand, but turns out he did. And I think he had more material account of the church and its necessity to be than he's often given credit for, or my little criticisms suggest. He was, Barth had only seen pretty much the Swiss church, and I think he would say that's not much of a church. So
Mm-hmm.
he could be quite critical and rightly so.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he doesn't. I mean, all Barth knew was established Christianity. He was attracted to people that like the Bruderhall.
Mm-hmm.
Those were his kind of folk, but he was an academic. He rarely went into actual ecclesial politics.
Yeah. I think
I was going to say, I think another
yeah.
kind of criticism of Barth the 19th century book is a wonderful book, but I think Barth was such a Germanic mind. He really didn't engage the English tradition. I would be fascinated if Barth really had read Newman, for example. And because I think people like Newman were providing an alternative to Protestant liberalism that Barth would have found very attractive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know he spent a good bit of time in America. I don't know. Was he reading American theologians? I know in your Gifford lectures, obviously you're working with kind of Niebuhr in comparison to Barth. But was he reading Niebuhr? Was he reading other American theologians?
I don't know. I've never seen Barth's library, but
Sure.
he would read certainly people he was criticizing, but I don't think he read widely in what they were about. No doubt he Nature and Destiny of Man probably, but it wasn't Barth's kind of thing to do that. He would read Bultmann, I think, quite thoroughly, but there were, I mean, Barth, what didn't he read? I mean, his reading of the Protestant scholastics was remarkable. They're pretty boring people.
Sure. So, one other kind of development in his thought that interests me a lot is because I think initially in his volume on Romans, he's drawing a really clean distinction between nature and grace, between God and humanity, and then from what I understand, he then sort of discovers Anselm, sort of discovers Roman Catholic analogical thinking, and starts to kind of nuance that clean distinction he had made. So could you say a little bit about how that kind of took shape as he started to grapple with kind of the analogical imagination?
Nature grace is not Barth's categories. He would use them at times characterizing or recepting other thinkers, but Barth represents the theological turn that the discovery of history makes possible. There's a lot in that kind of claim that I'm not going to try to explain, but he became more and more attracted to Catholicism, and I can't remember. I think it's in 2:1 where I think he discusses Shaban and says if Shaban gets nature grace right, then the Catholics are not wrong in how they think a natural theology is possible. But he says that's Shaban, even though he was a Jesuit, is not a Catholic.
Sure.
So Barth, I mean, there's such a dispute between McCormack and Hunsinger about the place of Anselm book, but I tend to be a bit more influenced by Hunsinger on how the importance of Anselm. Barth was an undertaking of helping us see how God shapes all we know in a way that nothing else compares.
Yeah.
If you hear that's Faith, my Siamese cat, who is declaring her views about Barth.
Okay, so in David Hunsiker's book, what is that book called? I think it's the Making of Stanley Hauerwas, Bridging Barth and Postliberalism. So he argues that you're Barthian in the sense that you're post-Barthian, right?
Yes.
Like you go beyond Barth, which is just kind of what Barth wanted his students to do. So do you think this is do you think that this is kind of an accurate assessment of the ways that you have tried to use Barth's theology in your work? And if so, in what ways have you tried to move beyond Barth?
I'm really indebted to Hunsinger. I think that's a fine book. And his intuitions about how I relate to Barth or how I use Barth, I think on the whole are just right. The Hunsinger's argument is that Barth, I read Barth in a post-liberal fashion. And what that means is that I read Barth as underwriting how it is that there is no foundation to begin doing theology. You just begin doing it. Because the foundations that so many theologians think are necessary turn out to be reductionistic epistemological presuppositions that make theological claims secondary. And what Hunsinger argues is, therefore, I read Barth with the eyes of someone schooled by Wittgenstein in a way that makes the theological claims do work without constantly worrying about whether the claims need some further backing to be intelligible. I try to show how the language of the faith is interconnected, forming a people that are different in the world.
Yeah. And so one other thing he's doing, which you're already sort of getting into with Wittgenstein. So Hunsiker, he kind of portrays your work, as the subtitle suggests, as in some way a fusion of Barth and then also the post-liberalism, but especially the kind of the Yale school post-liberalism. So kind of George Lindbeckian kind of post-liberalism. So what would you say are some kind of edifications that Barth and this form of post-liberalism can offer each other?
The meaningfulness of theological language when it does work. I think that's one of the most bottom lines that join Barth's way of doing theology with what is called post-liberalism. I confess that I don't like the language of post-liberalism very much because I'm not particularly attracted to labels, but make some people happy. they can use it.
Yeah, yeah. So when you're talking about kind of making the language of theology do work, what do you mean? What do you mean when you say do work?
Uh, that it is located in practices that are unintelligible if what the language we use doesn't appropriately describe, then you have some hint that you don't know what you're talking about. So I want to try to show how theological language and its formation by adequate speakers makes claims about the world. The world is finite. Their creation is ex nihilo. So on. That shape our way of negotiating the world in a way that what we say should be considered true. So there's a certain sense that I do philosophical work over Barth's theological claims.
Yeah. So would you say that there are sort of limits to language, especially when we're kind of engaging in God talk, when we're using theological language? Are there limits that we run up against? And then are there sort of I don't know, does liturgy and prayer, do things like this move us beyond these limits of language, or how would you speak of
I
that?
always think of Wittgenstein's claim. I put my shovel down here, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are language can force us to say what we did not know could be said in a way that remains fresh for the discovery of new things that need to be said.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of Paul Ricoeur, of like just his ideas of sort of endless hermeneutic, just kind of unraveling, which actually, in just kind of a surface level way, um, is sort of what Barth is doing in his whole church dogmatics.
Right. Ricoeur was an admirer of Barth,
Mm.
and it would be fascinating for someone to do a book on Ricoeur and Barth. Probably has been, I just don't know.
Yeah, yeah, that would be very fascinating. Okay, so in your most recent book, "Fully Alive: The Apocalyptic Humanism of Karl Barth," you're arguing. You kind of opened up the book by saying that Barth's, if any theologian's work could be described as apocalyptic, that it's Karl Barth's theology. So what do you mean here by apocalyptic? I know this is kind of a contested term, and that there are sort of different streams of thought that are doing different things with that word. So what do you mean when you use that word, and how can Barth's theology be described as apocalyptic?
I don't mean apocalyptic in terms of the destruction of cities, though that certainly is the case in Scripture. Apocalyptic, I mean that the cross determines the meaning of history, and therefore apocalyptic is the affirmation that all that is works within the framework of God's creative will to have us exist. That's, Doug Harnick's account of Apocalyptic is, I think, the best there is in terms of showing how the very existence of the church means Christians are shaped with convictions that take the world. So, apocalyptic is a strong account that when Mary was impregnated, the world began anew. And that's an apocalyptic line.
Yeah. So one of our guests for the Barth Booth on our interviews was Caitlin Dugan, who, as you probably know, I know you're familiar with her, obviously, but as you might know, she wrote her dissertation on kind of putting Pauline Apocalyptic in conversation with Barth's Apocalyptic, especially like considering death in sort of both of these streams. So how would you describe the relationship between kind of a Barthian apocalyptic, and you mentioned Doug Herink, who works kind of in Pauline apocalyptic, but how would you describe the relationship between these two? Are there differences? What are the similarities?
I'm not sure how I would think about differences. I think the recognition theologically that the world is not destined for eternity is one of the matters that should be recognized as reflections of apocalyptic, because apocalyptic isn't the same thing every day. It is that every day reflects God's will to have us exist every day. Barth never lost the sense how special that is.
Yeah. Let's move to also in Fully Alive. You're kind of comparing and contrasting the humanism of Karl Barth, which is unique because Barth's not typically described in those terms of humanism. So, but you're comparing his humanism with what you call, which I think may be a quote from, I think this may be the phrasing that Barth actually used, the high humanism of liberal Protestant theology. So what would you say are kind of the main distinctions between how Barth goes about his humanism and then the sort of high humanism of liberal Protestantism?
Barth humanism is Christological. And that Christ became fully human is the highest form of humanism you can possibly have. And by that, I mean that the Savior did not avoid the evil that hung him on a cross, and yet ruled that the one being crucified next to him would be redeemed. That's the high understanding of humanism that I think is there in Jesus' life and death.
Yeah. We've talked a bit already about kind of Barth's engagement with the American church, and I know he visited America and wrote letters to American churches, and some, and yeah, so in some way we could say kind of that your career has been, in some ways at least to some extent, applying sort of Barth's work to the American context. So how would you say that his life and his work can contribute to especially the American church's engagement with like political issues? Are there kind of critiques and contributions his thought might make to sort of the exchange that happens in America between religion and politics?
I don't know that Barth understood the American church very deeply.
Yeah.
Of course, he did a lot of reading about America. He loved the Civil War, and he read widely in it. And one of the things when the trip to America, one thing that he wanted to do was see Gettysburg. And he was taken there. I think he said that if he were an American theologian, the central concept in his theological work would be freedom. I don't know if he were stuck by that once he came face to face with American nationalism. But I think he admired the energy of American life. I think he was somewhat taken aback by the accommodation of the American church to the politics of American life.
Yeah. Do you see any kind of parallels between sort of the dangerous forms of, I guess we might call it like Christendom, that Barth was seeing in Germany, and as you say, sort of the accommodations that we see in the church to certain political just movements in America?
Obvious, quick answer is yes.
Yeah.
That's not. You don't have to have great insight to say that.
All right. Right.
Yeah, I mean, the American evangelical movement that has gone to the right is very disturbing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So in your Gifford lectures, you explore why Barth's Dogmatics is so long, why he's so verbose, and how the fact that it's so long sort of tells us something about the form that Barth felt theology actually should take, which you described in those lectures, I think, is complex simplicity. So if you could say a little bit about why is Church Dogmatics so long, and how is its length? How is sort of the manner that he kind of goes on and on in his theology? How is that instructive for how we think about the theological task?
I think the length of the Dogmatics is because Barth is teaching us how to talk. And that's an ongoing speech project that is at the very heart of what it means to say that Jesus Christ is Lord is true. So I am extremely attracted. You don't have to read all 14 volumes, but reading one is enough.
That's great. As far as folks who are kind of new to reading Barth, this is a question I also asked Kate Dugan and Kara Slade. What volume, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a church dogmatics volume, but just his books in general. What volume or volumes would you suggest people start with?
Oh, I think his book that were the lectures at Bonn after World War II, Dogmatics and Outline, is the book that everyone needs to read.
Okay.
It's a great book. He wrote that, but Dogmatics and Outline is just a brilliant book.
Yeah, and much more approachable than the 14 volumes for sure. So in your own case, is there a volume from the church dogmatics that you especially sort of cherish and that you find yourself coming to again and again?
4:2.
4:2. Okay. Why is that?
Because Jesus into the far country, such a compelling development of his Christological position.
That's something that Kara Slade also mentioned. I think she said that she reads that section of 4:2 every Lent. I've not read it, and I imagine a lot of our listeners haven't read it. So could you share a bit about what Barth is up to?
What he's up to is helping us see the humanity that is at the very heart of Jesus being the Son of God.
Okay, and then moving to kind of Barth's reception and then sort of the direction that Barthian scholarship, whether it's sort of strictly Barthian scholars or just folks who are working with Barth in some way, do you see any sort of young lights, any young thinkers sort of coming up whose work seems particularly promising?
I think there's quite a number. I think Princeton Seminary has been turning them out.
Yeah.
And I think Barth seems overwhelming. There's just so much of it. You're not sure you can get it all. But I think that the unapologetic character of the work is beginning to attract some really interesting young people.
Okay, so then a follow-up question would be, do you have kind of any hopes for how Barth might be applied in the North American context in the future? Like anything that you feel has been maybe sort of untapped or that you think could be explored further?
I think as the Protestant church declines, those who are at the center of the decline will find Barthian habits of great use for recovering the integrity of the Christian community's relationship to the kind of world in which we find ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. So I just want to say thank you very much, Stanley. It's been a real honor to chat with you. I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to talk.
How did you get the name Zachariah?
How did I get it? My parents, so my middle name is actually Malachi, so they were very big fans of the Minor Prophets, I guess. And so they named me Zachariah Malachi. I don't know that they had any rationale. I know that they wanted to give me a biblical name, and I think that they were just fond of sort of the
That's a great name.
The minor prophets for whatever reason. Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of a blessing and a curse because I have to, most people are not biblically literate, so I have to explain, why my name is Zechariah and how to pronounce it and all that. But it's a name that I'm proud of for sure.
Good. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Thank you, Sam.
Really. Bye-bye.
All right.